Today, I'd like to take you on a journey to, let's call it an imaginary world, a world in which buildings are alive, just as humans, or more generally, organisms are. So let's imagine that these buildings breathe, just as we do. They breathe fresh air in and stale air out. But let's go even further than that. Let's imagine that these buildings automatically regulate their indoors temperature around 24 degrees Celsius, which happens to be the temperature we humans feel comfortable in, just in the same way as we automatically regulate our own body temperatures around 36.6 degrees Celsius. Now, what do we do in order to keep this temperature? We sweat to cool ourselves down, right? And we shiver to warm ourselves up. So let's imagine that buildings can also keep their indoors temperature, just like climate-regulating organisms do. So without the use of any smart system or electricity, just based on the way that they're designed. Well, to tell you the truth, this is exactly how buildings used to work for thousands of years. And what might exceed our imagination today is that these buildings still existed until a few decades ago. Not in terms of shape, of course, but in terms of behavior. So what was the game changer? Well, it was the introduction of electricity that caused the end of that era and made buildings more and more dependent on external supplies. Yet, there are still a few places, a few survivors of that era that remain, and today I'd like to introduce you to some of them. So the first one is the traditional courtyard house in Oman that is mainly made from clay and wood, and which I was very happy to visit about 2 years ago. Now, when you see it, you will instinctively say, this building looks old, right? I mean, you won't instinctively say it looks smart, will you? Now, despite the fact that there was no natural wind in its surroundings, people would create an airflow through the building just by turning the play between shade and sun itself into an engine for wind. So I was standing there and looking up in the sky, and I could just feel how this fresh air was streaming through the rooms and through the whole building, just in the same way as fresh air was streaming through my lungs. So for me, it was in that very moment that I realized this building is actually alive. I mean, it's breathing, just like me. Nowadays, we tend to call our buildings smart and have sensors and apps and whatever. But for me, or to my understanding, smart means something entirely different. It's not something digital, it's ecological. For me, smart or intelligent architecture is the one that performs almost independently, but still perfectly, in the environment it actually stands in. Let's have a look at some more examples of the past. In Japan, for instance, which has a subtropical climate, that means hot, humid summers and dry, cold winters in some areas, buildings used to be tremendously sophisticated. So as you may know, ancient Japanese treasure houses, just like this one, were made entirely from wood. And as wood is a living or working material, as we say, that expands and contracts its cells when exposed to humidity, so just like a sponge, it can create movements that are so strong that it can even bend assembled wooden parts. So, depending on the prevailing weather conditions, microgaps would appear in between the lifted wooden parts and serve as natural ventilation for the building. I mean, that's unbelievable, isn't it? When I first read about this man-induced cell movement, I was completely bluffed to what extent or in what detail humans used to design their buildings even back then. My next example deals with extremes. Iran, for instance, that has a very dry climate and is known for its immense differences between day and night. So it gets really hot during the days and really cold in the nights, which is why people had the idea to design buildings whose walls acted as thermal storage. So, in other words, walls were just not made thick by coincidence, but in a way that the sun could heat them up during the hot days and release the same heat temporarily stored inside of the wall during the cold nights, so that some sort of temperature-regulating day and night cycle was created. So just imagine it's over 40 degrees Celsius outside, and the afternoon sun hits with all of its power on the external walls. But inside, pleasant 25, and there's no air conditioning, electricity, smart systems, machines, or whatsoever, but you can still feel this omnipresent coolness coming from these thick earth walls around you. And it's unbelievable, isn't it? As a last example, top it, I'd like to mention the massive clay domes called yakshas that can be found in the deserts of Iran. So, as you may know, these clay domes don't need anything but natural materials, geometry, shade, and airflow to store. and even produce ice in the middle of the desert. Can you imagine? They produce ice in the middle of the desert. And again, no electricity, no smart systems, machines, or no other technical means either, just natural intelligence that implements material behavior into design. Yet, sadly, somewhere along the way, all that wisdom seemed to have got lost as gradually control systems started to replace natural processes. So buildings were no longer understood as local living organisms, but as machines that no longer need to adapt and can therefore be built just anywhere in the world. So I'd like to think of them as some sort of hospital patients with breathing difficulties that need some ventilation systems in order to keep them alive. And what's even worse is that these kind of, let's just call them design errors nowadays, are tolerated or even accepted, as it could just be compensated with the excessive use of fossil energy. But by using that kind of energy, we tend to forget that this artificial comfort has an immense cost. And this is the habitability of our planet in the long run. So an additional challenge we are already facing due to climate change is that the already underperforming buildings now no longer stand in the environments they were originally built in. I call this climate reclassification. So in other words, climatically speaking, Central Europe is more and more becoming like Southern Europe, as the temperatures have already been rising drastically in the past years. So what appeared to seem to work on some conditions now increasingly starts to fail. And however, unlike in space, where every tiny little design error has immediate consequences, here on Earth, this damage unfolds so slowly that it can hardly be noticed. And this is exactly the problem, that this artificial comfort that we have is built on delay. So by the time we might feel the consequences, it might already be too late to correct them. So I'd like you to think again, or imagine again, this imaginary world in which buildings live, breathe, and adapt themselves to their natural surroundings. What would that mean? It would mean that we could save 1/3 of the entire global energy demand. It would also mean that our buildings and homes would no longer be dependent on AC, on machines, on tubes, on wires, or whatsoever. It would also mean that we would be able to leave a habitable home to our next generation and the one after that. And it would ultimately mean that we would allow ourselves to survive as a species on this planet. Which is why both researchers and practitioners now increasingly re-explore and reintroduce these time-tested principles, these ancient techniques that have been adjusted over and over again for generations and centuries. And even more so, as we're facing an energy crisis, we need to find a way out. And a way out can already be found in some places of the world. So, among others, the same ventilation technique that was used to ventilate the traditional courtyard house in Oman are now to be found in the Pearl Academy of Fashion in Jaipur in India. And the same wooden cell activation that was used to ventilate the Japanese treasure houses are now with the microgaps are now to be seen in form of lamellas in this self-ventilating pavilion in Stuttgart in Germany. And the same temperature-regulating day and night cycles that were used in the clay houses in Iran are now to be found in Melbourne's council house these days. So, summing up, we don't need machines that learn. We need buildings that are resilient, that are flexible, that adapt. In other words, buildings that don't fight the environment, but belong to it. Anything else has proven to be, or certainly going to prove as a design error. I mean, would you design a car that can be driven on the street, or shoes that can be worn? Of course not, it makes no sense. So why would someone design a building that can't withstand the climate it actually stands in? That's absurd. This is why I'm convinced that architecture should once again follow the climate, and with it, life itself. Thank you.